Okay, so welcome back. If you're just joining us now, you're watching AynRandCon Live. This is an online event brought to you by the Ayn Rand Institute. We're about to start part 3 of our multi-part event. And I'm joined by Greg Salmieri. Greg is a lecturer at Rutgers University and an Anthem Foundation Fellow and a frequent speaker for the Ayn Rand Institute. And he's going to talk about thinking objectively in times of crisis. So I'll turn it over to you. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Keith. An objective thinker is one who is aiming in his thinking at knowing the truth and who is using a reality-based method, in short, the method of logic, to reach the truth, rather than simply relying on his feelings. Why do we need such thinking? Since our minds and reality each are what they are, we need to think in specific ways rather than following our emotions if we want to reach knowledge rather than, for example, just reassuring ourselves. And we need knowledge in order to survive. This is all especially true and especially challenging in times of crisis, times when so much is on the line and so much is unknown. That's my subject today. This talk is a sort of sequel or follow-up to a group of talks I gave on objective thinking starting around 2014, most of which are collected in a course called Thinking Objectively. What I'm going to do here today in the little bit of time we have is to revisit and reframe some of the topics I discussed there in light of how they apply in crisis times. So for people who've heard the course, I'll be elaborating and building on some of the points and advice I gave there. But this talk should be intelligible to people who haven't heard the other talks. And I hope that if you like what you'll hear, you'll turn to those other earlier lectures and to the sources I recommend in them for more material along the same lines. But by way of framing what I'm going to do here, let me just say a word or two about the specific topics of those earlier talks, and that will set up some of the context for today. The main talk, called Thinking Objectively, is on the theme that knowledge is work. And I talk about the kinds of work that are involved in knowing and in maintaining your knowledge. And I'm going to talk more about that today. Another talk in the series is being an objective consumer of science, where I talk about what it means to be an independent thinker in context where you need to rely on a division of intellectual labor to do much of the work involved in knowing the things you want or need to know. And I think we're seeing a lot of need to consume science well now. And in being objective about objectivism, I discuss the process of thinking through a radical philosophy that you've learned from someone else, with special attention to the issues raised when one is part of a community of people who are studying and trying to live by these ideas. And I think since we're all relying on our philosophy, both those of us who are objectivists and hold Ayn Rand's really radical philosophy, and those people in the world who aren't, we're all relying on our philosophical principles to try to understand what's going on in the world and to evaluate it. Thinking about how you're objective about those, how you know those, is something that we should pause to think about a little bit in this time. And then finally, in another talk, Thinking for Yourself, which is not part of that original course, but is up on ARI's webpage or on YouTube, that was from a conference on individualism and tribalism, where I talked about the special challenges to objectivity that are caused by the non-ideological political polarization we see all around us today. And I think that is also a big factor in the current crisis. What I mean by non-ideological political polarization is that we have camps that are not separated from one another by the fact that they're committed to different ideas, and then they join the camps because of it. But rather, we have camps that are essentially tribes held together by group loyalty and animus. And the ideas people hold, for the most part, in the what's called today the left and the right, follow from their allegiance to the group and their trust of certain individuals rather than any principles that they hold. So with that as context, the things I want to discuss today are what's motivating our thinking in times of great certainty, high emotion, and high polarization, the role of philosophical principles in thinking about concretes, and how we should be processing expert conclusions from fields in which we are inexpert. First, on motivation, our aims in thinking. Knowledge is work. Everything that we want to know takes work to learn. whether to discover it for the first time if we're the originators of the knowledge, or to validate it if we're learning it from someone else. And it takes continued work to maintain that knowledge, to relate it to new information as it comes in. Now, we each have limited time and capacity in our lives, so we will never know everything, or even everything that could save our lives if we did know it. Of course, the more you know, the better, and you should always be striving to learn more. But since you do have limited time and resources, we need to prioritize. And just getting rid of the expectation that you're supposed to have all the answers, that mankind in general is supposed to have them, or that you're supposed to know them, getting rid of that expectation helps to be realistic about what you do know and what you don't know, and to make good decisions about what to put the work into finding out. Again, by the nature of a crisis, it's a time when a lot of really important things are unknown. Many of those things are unknown altogether. Nobody knows the percentage of people affected with SARS-CoV-2 who are symptomatic, who have intense disease, who dies. Nobody knows how exactly the virus exploits the ACE2 receptor to get into cells. Nobody knows how effective the various drugs that are being tested are, how effective they are in different doses or different combinations, how effective they are for different sorts of patients, how effective they are at different stages in the progress of the disease. Nobody knows when there will be a widely available vaccine, what the death toll will be, how much poorer we will all be as a result of the havoc wreaked both by the virus itself and by the responses to it by governments the world over. No one knows exactly what the political consequences of all of this will be in all the affected countries around the world. So these are it's just knowledge that no one has yet. Then there were things that are known by some people, but which most of us don't know and may have a hard time figuring out. Suppose you want to know what protocols are being used by the most capable doctors today. How do you find that out? How do you tell which doctors are the most capable? How do you learn what they're using? What sources can you rely on for that information? It takes work to work that all out, and it's hard. Someone knows what information the Chinese Communist Party is hiding, but I don't, and it would be hard for me to figure it out. And likewise, there are questions about how medical supplies from the national stockpiles in the US are being distributed to different states. Journalists are trying to work that out, not quite known. So there's a lot that's unknown at all, and a lot that's unknown to you, and you have to think about what you want to know, what it would take to know it, and how to do it. In such situations, the stakes are high and emotions run high. Everyone is scared and or angry. People don't want to face the fact of how much damage is occurring, how many people are dying quickly in certain places, how many are being impoverished, what the long-term consequences of this are, how little we know, and that there's no quick fix to return to normal. These are uncomfortable facts, and it takes some courage to face them and think about them. And a lot of people, particularly people in authority, I think there's ample evidence, are not facing these facts. They're faking about them. Relatedly, a lot of us want someone to blame, whether it's the Chinese, Trump, Democrats, journalists. And a lot of us want someone to trust, whether it's Trump, Fauci, Cuomo, or your favorite pundit. These emotions are fine, and they're natural, whether you find them in yourself or others, but they're not tools of cognition. Fearing the worst or hoping for the best doesn't make either so, or give you any reason to think that either is so. And it's easy in such circumstances to fall into thinking that's aimed at something other than knowing the truth, that's aimed at putting down your adversaries, defending something you want to believe, reassuring yourself, etc. So we need to be aware of that possibility in ourselves and in the people in whom we rely on as sources. More importantly, we need to think about what we're aiming for. Is our goal really to learn what's true about a given topic, or to reassure yourself, or to defend some position, person, or faction? If there's an idea that you think is true and you encounter an objection to it, of course you should try to see what's mistaken in the idea or in the objection. And of course you'll start by expecting the problem to be in the objection, since you have reasons already for thinking the idea is true. But the goal should be to work out the truth, not to defend whatever you already think, come what may. Likewise, it's proper and often important to judge people, especially to judge politicians who we have to vote for and against. But in our thinking about that, we should be looking to find the truth about their character, their actions, and their consequences, not just to convict the ones we dislike of every evil, or to acquit the ones we see as on our side of every fault. The same goes for intellectuals we might be following, politicians, newspaper writers, etc. So really think about when you're asking a question, when you're looking into something, when you're reading, when you're researching, when you're thinking, when you're arguing, what am my goal here? What is my goal here? Is there some question I'm trying to find the facts about, to find the truth about, and what is it? And then supposing you are trying to find the truth rather than some other motive, why? Why this issue? Why now? Is there a decision you need to make that you need to know the answer to this question to make it? And that's why you're looking into it, and at the level of priority that the decision is? If so, how important is the decision? Or on the other hand, is it just curiosity? Curiosity is a fine and good motive. You're trying to stock your pile of knowledge generally, and it's wonderful. But that's different from you're trying to find it out to answer this question on this timeline with this urgency. Or is it that the world feels so uncertain to you and you want to find what certainty you can in it? That's okay too. But notice that that's what you're doing. If you're unaware of your own motivation, it could lead to poor thinking, to being defensive, to obsessing over details when they're not really what's most important to you to know, to get the perspective you need, or to make the decisions you need to make. But you feel like, well, I could really figure this one number out if I spend enough time on it. And so you obsess on that. Now, what is the role in all of this of philosophical principles? How do they help us think well? How do they help us make sense in a time of uncertainty? Well, philosophy is the most abstract discipline, the discipline that gives us an orientation to the universe as such, to where we are, to how we can know, to what's right and how we should live. And in times of uncertainty, they help us deal with uncertainty about comparative details by giving us a broader framework that we're certain about, if indeed we are. For example, we can know that dishonesty is wrong and destructive. And if we know that, we know not to take dishonest actions. We know that when we recognize some action as dishonest, that only bad and no good could come of it. We know that we shouldn't act this way or take specific actions, for example, pretending that the facts are other than they are with the disease. And when we recognize particular people who have done this, the Chinese Communist Party, Donald Trump, some reporter, whomever it might be, we know that this action has been destructive and it's bad and we shouldn't support it. But none of that lets us specify the details and the scale. Suppose these people had faced the fact sooner, the ones I mentioned. It would have been better, but how much less destruction would there have been? What particular calamities would have been averted? I don't know. But I don't need to know that to know that I need to be facing the facts now rather than facing them about whatever issues are confronting me in the pandemic. That I should be supporting people who are addressing the issue honestly rather than those who seem to be faking to themselves. And that I should not be supporting or listening to people who are just making political hay out of the situation, or who are engaging in some vague happy talk or justifications of themselves in the past, people who are pretending that all the medical or economic problems will go away magically and quickly any moment, or who are pretending that there's no better that we could have done in this situation because this was totally unprecedented and nobody had any idea anything like this could happen, when in fact, lots of people did know exactly that this kind of thing could happen. And their job was to be at the ready for it too. Likewise, if we know that regulation is wrong and we understand why regulation is wrong, we know that regulations of tests, drugs, and the like are parts of the problem here, not the solution, and that part of the solution has to be suspending these regulations. We know that even if we don't know whether a given drug or test that's been slowed by regulation is any good, and even if we don't know whether regulation in particular is the bottleneck with certain drugs we might want, we don't know how big a contributor this particular evil is to each aspect of our current plight. Likewise, on the side of things we might know philosophically are good, like productiveness and rationality and honesty. Doctors working diligently in dangerous conditions are admirable. Pharma companies taking the initiative to quickly find new solutions are admirable. Tech companies meeting increased demand for example, bandwidth during this situation are doing the right thing and are admirable. But we don't know just from this principle which products are good, how useful each would be, etc. So it's important when you're using philosophical principles to differentiate what you know based on the principle without needing specialized concrete knowledge, what you can know just based on the philosophical principle and general observations of what's going on, and what you can't, what you'd need specialized advanced technical knowledge to know. You'll find that there is knowledge you can have based on the principle without specialized expertise, and that knowledge matters. but you'll also find that you won't know everything that way that you might want to. So there are two errors here. One is to assume too much about the concretes on the basis of your principles and little else. For example, to assume that a certain drug is good because the FDA has been delaying it and some people are fighting the FDA. Maybe the drug's no good. Just that the FDA is fighting it doesn't mean it is good. On the other hand, you can think that you can't know anything about the concrete situation based on the principle. In this particular case I mentioned of the FDA, we can know that the FDA is doing harm by forcibly stopping people from using their judgment about the drug, even if we don't know in this situation whether these people's judgment is any good. Maybe they'd be fools to use the drug, but they have every right to. And it would be a world in which we're all able to learn more if they were, and live our own lives better if they were free to do it. So far, I've mentioned a few philosophical principles that are guiding me in my thinking about this: the value of honesty, the evil of regulation, the value of rationality, the virtue of productiveness. And I've been assuming that we actually know these principles. And I think I do know the ones that I've referenced. But if I do know them, it's because I've done the work to reach this knowledge. And I have to do the continual work to maintain that knowledge in an ever-expanding context. I have to think about how the principles relate to new evidence as it arrives. I have to think about how they apply to situations I've not considered before. And if I don't do this, the philosophical principles ossify and become floating abstractions. Likewise for each of you. So I want to say a word about checking your premises when those premises are philosophical principles. Ayn Rand, of course, and through Hugh Axton and Francisco d'Anconia, gives the advice that you should check your premises. When? Well, in particular, when you uncover a contradiction, when you come across a contradiction in your thinking. I see this advice as a special case of a broader phenomenon. When you use a premise, a principle is a type of premise, to understand a situation, what you learn from doing that redounds in one way or another back on the premise itself. And sometimes that redounding back takes the form of a sort of counter pressure. You reach a contradiction and you know that somewhere you're mistaken in one of your premises. Or even short of that, the concretes just don't turn out as you expected in light of the principles you hold. And it can give you reason to doubt the principle, or maybe to doubt that you're understanding or applying the principle correctly. On the other hand, sometimes everything just goes swimmingly, and the use you make of the principle confirms your, in understanding the concrete, confirms your facility with the principle. Other times, the concrete illuminates the principle in other ways, giving you a fuller understanding of its scope and meaning. An example of this last, learning Ayn Rand's application of property rights to the issues of airwaves and intellectual property radically expanded my understanding of property and of rights. In the present example, thinking about how rights apply to the field of contagious disease, the infectious disease, as per Ankar's talk earlier, might expand your understanding of the principle of rights, the principle of the right to liberty in particular. So it's work to hold these principles. You have to check them, and checking them isn't just maybe they're wrong, but thinking about, like, as I'm applying them, as I'm using them, what am I learning about them? What am I learning that might lead me to think some of my principles might be wrong, or I might be misunderstanding them? Or what am I learning to give me a wider or more fleshed out view of them? But what I want to talk about in particular, that I think we're having a lot of occasion for now, is checking premises in contexts of intense disagreement. We here on this call, and you in particular, are not the only ones with a worldview. Other people are interpreting the situation we're going through in light of their own premises, their own philosophies, their own ideas, which might disagree with ours. And since principles are what help us make sense of difficult times in particular, all times, but particularly difficult, scary ones, disagreements can become heated, intense, often personal. People feel threatened by them. Other people are interpreting this situation in light of principles that are opposite to yours and can criticize yours. There was an article I saw a couple of weeks ago. There are no libertarians in a pandemic, like there are no atheists in Foxhole. Libertarianism is a package deal, not a term I'd use for my view, but my views are meant to, Ayn Rand's views, and the ones I hold, are meant to be included by the author of that article. You hear ideas of the sort that the way we're all in this together gives the lie to the idea of individualism. I have an acquaintance on Facebook, someone I went to graduate school with, who wrote the following post. I never want to hear anybody justify capitalism on the basis of its magical ability to reconcile supply and demand ever, ever again. Notice 3 evers, actually, ever, ever, ever again. Notice the kind of intensity of that, the kind of anger of that, and the taking of the conclusion is obvious, coming from, in this case, a kind of Marxist perspective, that capitalism is what's at fault here. You may think she's obviously wrong. I do. What capitalism do we have that's supposed to be have been reconciling supply and demand in this case? I don't see any in medicine. But we ourselves can be angry, defensive, oblivious. If you're in the position of feeling like you have to defend your principles, like you're under attack, the very principles that are helping you make sense of the world. So how do you approach this? I think it's important to think about what principles you're relying on to understand what's going on when these kind of disputes, disagreements come up, and to think firsthand about why you're sure of them. To think about it non-defensively, not maybe I'm wrong, how can I tell I'm not? But just like, yeah, how do I know this? How can I tell? What am I sure of here? Remind yourself what in fact you find convincing about the principle and see if you do find it convincing. This is opposed to looking for a proof of it, a proof that somehow seems more respectable or scientific than whatever is actually driving you yourself to accept the point. The premise behind looking for these sorts of proofs, what I call dishonest reductions in my lecture on thinking objectively, the premise behind looking for them is that reason and evidence are a kind of show to justify yourself to others, that for your own sake, whims are enough, and that the specific factors that cause you personally to take the positions you do are some kind of guilty secret. But hopefully that's not true of you. It shouldn't be true of you. And it doesn't have to be, if it is, in any case, with anything you happen to believe. Just simply ask yourself, what am I sure of here? And why am I sure of it? And review it in simple terms. Why do I think it's good to be rational? Why do I think dishonesty is wrong? Why do I think freedom is good? And having reviewed your own reasons for believing in whatever principles you're using, that will make the meaning of the principles clearer to you and less floating. And in light of all of that, think afresh about how the principles apply to the given situation you're in. Maybe it'll be clear how they apply. That's good. Then you'll know something and know what to do. Maybe it won't be clear to you. And that's fine too. If you acknowledge that, now here's a place where you have more work to do. And you can do that work now and know the answer, the particular thing about the situation. Or you can decide, no, I don't understand this well enough yet, this particular issue, this aspect of this, and it's something I'll work out later if I need to. Shifting now a bit abruptly to the topic of experts. One of the points I make in the course about being an objective consumer of science, or the lecture about it, is that there's a false alternative between thinking you can be a universal Google expert on your own by just doing some quick searches and figuring out everything on your own, and that somehow is what it means to be an expert, to know things for yourself, to think it through for yourself. And on the other hand, the idea that the alternative to that is to be a slavish follower of the establishment, of whoever is presented to you as an expert, or whoever, for some reason, you get it into your head, knows better. In the case of this pandemic, there are a lot of people who are experts and who we need to rely on to know what's happening, what to do. Doctors are the obvious example, but not just doctors, lots of relevant subspecialties, virologists, epidemiologists, etc. Also, when we're thinking about the societal impact of this, and particularly there's economists and other people. And I think there's a particular category of expert that there hasn't been enough attention to. There's such a thing as experts in pandemic preparedness. Figuring out what will happen in the case of a pandemic, what will happen if we take different courses of action, is a complex bit of mental work that requires integration of material from several different specializations, economics, politics, various fields of medicine, etc. And there are people who spend their life doing this work. Knowledge is work, different kinds of knowledge, different topics require different works, and there are people who specialize in them. There are people whose life's work has been drawing on all these other fields to anticipate situations like the one we're in, work out what would occur in them, what policy options there would be, what the effects of different policies might be, how to prepare, etc. As it happens, I have a friend, Amish Adalja, who I think Yaron's mentioned a few times earlier, who is one of these experts, who's someone who's worked on this, for his whole life. The people presumably who worked on the CDC recommendations that Ankar listed earlier were people who would, this was what they did. Was their expertise. And talking to people who know about this in particular is like a night and day difference with talking to just general doctors, economists, etc. My point isn't that all of these people are always right, that my friend here is particularly right on everything. After all, there are different experts in this field and they don't agree on everything. But my point is just to concretize, there's a specific field here. There's specific work needed to know about this. There's specific expertise, and we should be respecting that and thinking about that and thinking about who has it, rather than imagining that we can and should reinvent every wheel afresh here. Now, in dealing with an expert, in making use of the advice of an expert on any issue, there are a number of questions that arise. First, how do you tell if someone really is an expert? I discussed this in the lecture I gave on this earlier, and some of it will be implied by what I go on to say here. So I'm going to take it as read for now, that you have some reason for thinking the people that you're taking as experts are experts. And what we mean by experts is people who have done some of the specialized work needed to know the things that you need to know and don't. But then, given that someone is an expert, you have reason to think they have this specialized knowledge. How do you deal with them, and how should they deal with you? The first important thing to keep in mind here, in my view at least, is that experts are not oracles. They shouldn't be making pronouncements and expecting you to believe them on the basis of their credentials or alleged expertise, while leaving you wholly in the dark as to their reasons. A real expert can indicate or outline his reasoning to you. That's part of objectively communicating with you. And if an expert isn't willing to do this, it's a real warning sign. You can ask questions once he outlines his reasoning to you and think about whether the reasoning makes sense. Do you understand it? In outline again. But the expert having outlined his process of reasoning for you, and you're being able to make some judgments about it, isn't the same thing as you're performing, or even you're being competent to perform, that same process of reasoning independently of him. It doesn't put you in his epistemic shoes, because you lack the context to evaluate in detail all the steps, and to know about all the possible alternatives, counter-arguments, other coloring considerations that there might be. So you want to get a kind of outline of the expert's reasoning. You want to compare it to other arguments you've heard, but you want to take it as still, you don't now know it the way he does. You're relying on his expertise. But then how can you tell that he's right? Well, things that go into this: basic judgment of his rationality and objectivity, judgment of his credentials, but importantly, relation to other experts. There's always disagreement among experts in every field, not on every aspect of everything in each field, but always on some aspects of some things. And where there's disagreement, you don't want to be following the opinion of this expert over that one because he's the first one you happened upon, or because he's your friend, or agrees with you on some issue unrelated to the relevant expertise. So what you want to get a sense of is the range of expert opinion if the issue matters to you. And the experts you're relying on ought to be helping you to situate their opinions relative to their field. That is, they should differentiate the relatively uncontroversial things they're saying from the controversial ones, from the ones where there's going to be more disagreement. And if you look at sensitive, careful experts writing and speaking on this, you'll see that they do this all the time. Some things they offer as unqualified, they'll just say it, and others they'll say, for example, there's a lot of disagreement in this field about how useful masks are for the general public. And some people think you should wear them. I think you should or shouldn't, whatever it might be. Now, ascertaining the state of a field can itself require specialized skills. So we're often reliant on chains or series of experts, credentialing organizations, science journalists, etc., to figure out who here knows something that we should be paying attention to. And the same issues that arise with, for example, medical experts arise for this whole establishment of middlemen whose job it is to help you understand what the consensus or range in the establishment view is. So one factor that's got to be a factor, or one thing that has to be a factor in your judgment of any science you're consuming, has to be a judgment of this establishment, which means of the media, of this educational systems, of our institutions. And judgment of such establishments should not be binary. The kind of knowledge establishment we have in present-day America is clearly a lot better than the knowledge establishment of the USSR or of 9th century Paris. On the other hand, it clearly leaves a lot to be desired, or I think it leaves a lot to be desired. So it's not, you can't trust them or you can. It's how good are they? What kind of things are they better at and worse? How can I tell that on the basis of my experience with them in the past? What things that have been predicted have proven true and which haven't? Which ones have been sensitive to the kind of concerns of reasonable, skeptical lay people and which ones haven't, and so forth. And again, you might find that the establishment is better in some fields than others, or at some times than others. Maybe they're good over a long period of time on certain issues, but tend to go wrong in times of panic. That's something you're going to have to judge for yourself over time, but it's got to be a factor in your thinking about what you're reading on this now. In particular, I think it's a factor in reading about science reporting. My sense is that everybody is panicked now, and the response to the pandemic has been very highly politicized. I think in situations like that, the news is especially unreliable with respect to even things like establishing the range of qualified opinion on issues regarding the pandemic and the treatments and so forth. But even there, you might find that some outlets are better than others. I'll give you some of my qualified findings. Cable news shows are one and all awful, at least as far as I can tell. The major newspapers are, I think, a bit better than them, but not too good. But specialized publications like Stat News, which has been recommended to me by a number of people and whom I've started reading, which is a science and medical news newspaper, has articles that contain qualified information, point you to original studies, aren't hysterical, and don't seem like they're out to praise or get some person, but I found it really helpful in understanding the context. So there's a particular recommendation. Now, if you come to think that the establishment is mistaken, that consensus views are wrong, or in any case, less good than you'd like them to be, it's important to realize that that usually doesn't put you in a position to know what alternative views are right. There's usually a mainstream range of opinion, and then there's alternative science outside of it. Sometimes some of those alternative science theories are true. But the mere fact that you can see some problems with the mainstream does not put you in a position to know whether they're true or to know which ones are true. And you really, I think, have to be on guard against embracing particular alternative views or hypotheses if you've become disillusioned with something in the mainstream. There are a lot of pseudoscientists out there, people who are trying to convince you of some alternative by playing on your discomfort with uncertainty. They flatter your vanity and create illusions of knowledge, not yours, but people's. They give you some kind of outline of an argument, but it's one that you should know that you're not in a position to evaluate because it requires a whole kind of expert knowledge that you don't have. And it's not being related in responsible ways to the opinions of other experts in the field to alert you to the questions you should be asking about it. Typically, pseudoscience is delivered with a level of dismissiveness or contempt for mainstream research that you and the alleged expert should know cannot be justified in your context. I can give examples of that if you like. Generally, this kind of pseudoscience veers into conspiracy theory territory. It trades on your wanting to think you're smarter than the average bear and you're wanting to have someone to blame. And you can't cheat an honest man. So I think you have to just really think about, what do I know here? Why am I doing this? What am I looking for? If you follow the advice earlier, it will kind of steer you away from that. But there's a much more honest and more sophisticated kind of way of going wrong here with respect to experts, which I think of as amateur epidemiology. There are a lot of people, a lot of us, do have some real skills at things like data science, biology, etc. And we try crunching our hand at crunching the numbers in epidemiology or related fields. And what we do when we do that is continuous with the process of reading expert opinion and trying to think it through for myself. But it's very easy when doing this to think one knows or understands more than one actually does. There's a sort of judgment and experience that people who do this for a living have from years of studying past outbreaks and past responses to the outbreaks that the rest of us don't have. So I just want to give some examples of what a real expert in this would know that we just don't. I just don't. They have a sense of what facts are important and which ones aren't, including things like how much it matters whether a disease has human-to-human transmissibility, whether any such diseases have ever been contained and how they could be contained, like, for example, travel restrictions. The importance of limited resources to thinking about what our response should be. This is something that pandemic preparedness experts think about that you might not have and I hadn't. They have a skill on how to essentialize the situation that they're experts in. They know what cases to compare the current one to in various respects in which comparison might be relevant, not just those one or two that have already been hyped by the media, like, say, the Spanish flu or H1N1. They know what mistakes are commonly made when predicting the courses of epidemics, the degree to which early testing in such situations is or isn't severity biased, the degree in such a situation to which reported deaths under or over report the actual death caused by it from, how it's happened in past cases. They know what the state of the field of infectious disease modeling is. How accurate have the best models been in past situations like this? Which past situations are relevantly like this one? What is the best way to make use of all the different sorts of models that exist in trying to come to understand the situation and predict what's going to happen? They also, if they're real experts who have thought about this, have some sense of the effects on the ground of different policies over time. For example, if a hotel is converted into a shelter for homeless people in a pandemic, what can be expected to happen in that hotel? They might have experienced, because that kind of thing's happened before. Or if doctors from other fields are called in to help in an emergency, how helpful can those doctors be and how long does it take for them to get up to speed? There are a million questions like this that if you don't know, and I don't know, you don't know are relevant. And this is the kind of thing you have to be aware of when you're trying to think for yourself about what the curve is, what will flatten it, how will this policy go, etc., what will happen. I don't say don't do those things, one should, but one should be very aware that when one's doing it, one's out of one's bailiwick, that there are people who are professionals at this. You shouldn't blindly follow them, but you should be interested in how are they doing it? What do they know that I don't? And you should be, kind of looking for that, looking to check your knowledge up against them and not so much giving them challenges as saying, this seems to me like this. What, if anything, am I missing? So just a few remarks to conclude. What should we be doing in times of great uncertainty, where there's a lot we don't know and a lot is on the line? Recognize that knowledge is a value. Recognize that the knowledge requires work. Take responsibility for doing the work you need to do to know the things you need and want to know. And value and make good use of those who are doing the work needed to enable you to know things you otherwise couldn't, particularly those who have been doing it for a long time and have stores of expertise here. If you can't get the specific knowledge you'd like, think about what things you can know more easily that will help you make your way through this time. To quote an old song, or paraphrase an old song, you can't always know what you want, but if you try sometimes, you just might find you'll know what you need.
And on that note, I guess we'll take some questions, Greg.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So we got a question. This was posted on Zoom as a question for Dr. Brooke, but I think it's relevant to what you've just been discussing. So this is from Professor D. Basically, I'll summarize it. It's saying there are objectivist intellectuals who are commenting on this issue, and there's a lot of disagreement, even quite polar opposite disagreement. So how do you think about the issue of applying a broad set of principles like objectivism to a concrete issue like this?
Well, I'd want a sense of what kind of disagreements we're talking about. Not everyone who calls themselves an objectivist or an objectivist intellectual, those very much. But of people who I think are reasonable, rational, thoughtful, there's a lot of room for, there's a lot of things no one knows, and there's a lot of room for disagreement. If you're not in a position to know something like, is this drug a good drug? Will it work? Will this policy work? I think you have to be making, what is the basis of this policy? Very qualified recommendations, say, or not make recommendations, but just say, this is where I stand on this. And you'll notice I'm not, for example, saying what drugs are good and bad. But I think it's a better question. Let's readdress it on the panel with Yaron, because he was making more specific points about policy, most of which I agree with. And
Well, that's what the questioner is asking. You know, should we, you know, the opinions range all the way from the government should be taking things over to prevent, you know, to flatten the curve and prevent, you know, hospitals from being overrun, et cetera, all the way to the other side on
right.
the. So
if we're actually answering the object level question, what should the policy be?
Right.
I'd rather do that with the three of us on the panel,
Okay.
but just on how should we think about it? You should think about, well, what principles are you, if you're thinking about this, or the various philosophers or commentators who are commenting on it, what principles are they drawing on? Like the principle of individual rights, or whatever other principles might be part of their argument. Why do we think those principles are true in the first place? Remind yourself of that kind of simply. What's the context for them? And then how do they apply here? And that's a kind of very abstract case. And then if we have an actual disagreement in front of us, like, then we can think about what mistakes are being made by one party or another. But I mean, I agree with Ankar's take on what it means in the American system of government. And I agree very much with Yaron that you have to think about the context of what our present society is, and not imagine that we're in a utopia and criticize the government for not doing what the government in that utopia would do. Not that utopia is impossible. It is possible, but it's not where we are now, and you can't get there overnight. So I think people are often thinking in a way that's non-causal and that is not serious. But, you know, we'll have to look at particular arguments, and hopefully we can do it in the panel at the end.
So the arguments that people are making, this is a question from Andrew on Zoom, you know, people using this situation to promote Medicare for all. This came up in one of the sessions. Do you think people are making those arguments honestly, or what's behind them, I guess, is the question that the person is asking.
What dishonesty there is, I don't think is trickery. I think rather what happened in all of these situations is you have a philosophical framework that you're taking with you to evaluate the situation. And if your framework is freedom and values require people to produce them, and that requires them to be free, and they have every right to produce them for themselves and trade them and so forth. If that's your framework, and human beings live by reason needs freedom and so forth, then you're going to look and see a shortage of badly needed supplies in an emergency, which a lot of people saw coming or knew was possible, and yet somehow there are not enough hospital beds in some places, and the hospitals are losing money at the same time, as in one way, the way that Dr. Brook described it before. If, on the other hand, your whole view of the world is that we're all in this together, it's up to society to provide for all of us, and those greedy fat cats who exploit the poor, and things come from the toil and spread of the brow of the exploited proletariat, and so forth, if that's how you've been viewing the world up till now, well, no surprise that you'll look at the situation now and think, you know, it's because some plutocrat, you know, has a swimming pool full of gold that, you know, some poor guy's dying in Queens and doesn't have a ventilator, or at least there's a threat that he might not have a ventilator. So the question is the honesty of maintaining that whole worldview over time. The first thoughts that are going to occur to you in the context of the pandemic of what caused this, what's wrong, are going to be governed by what principles you hold. But part of maybe you hold them because you were a poor thinker and made mistakes in the past, or you did your best but you still made mistakes, or you were dishonest in the past, or maybe you were right about them in the past, whatever the principles are. But it's not like you learn them in the past and then that's that. You have to think about them afresh in light of what's going on now. Do they really make sense of that? Did countries that were more socialized fare better than ones that were less? What can we learn about that? And as you integrate it over time, you, if you're being honest, and what being honest here means is you're trying to know the truth rather than faking. You want what's real, not a comforting illusion. And if you're doing it methodically, logically, rationally, you will your ideas will get closer and closer to the truth, and you'll come to see the error of your ways if you're mistaken. But honesty in this context is, it's a heavy lift. It's something that you have to do over time, that's serious, that requires the kind of work I was talking about all through the talk. And it's not just, the alternative to it is you're a huckster in the moment.
All right, so you talked about relying on experts, and we have, in this situation, we have a lot of experts constructing models, and trying to make predictions of what's going to happen based on those models. So we have a questioner, an anonymous questioner on Zoom, asking if you can comment on the epistemic status of those predictions and those models.
Yes and no. Well, the first thing to comment on about it is that I don't know what their epistemic status is, because I don't know enough about how the models work, what their track record is in the past, etc. I think before you rely on them, before you have confidence in them, that's something you need to look into. Just because someone's made a model and he's got a PhD, what's this guy's track record? What's the track record of the whole field of modeling of infectious diseases? And my understanding from the experts I've talked to, not on modeling, but on emerging diseases, and from the experts I've seen on the news about it, is that the field is not very good. The models always reliably way over predict the death toll. What they do is they give you a kind of sense of what would happen in a fairly unrealistic worst case scenario if nobody did anything, basically, at all in response to this, including the kind of voluntary actions people would do without having to rely on anyone's advice to do them. And so, the kind of initial numbers you get from the models are, I gather from the experts I've talked to, known to not be, very likely to be true. Plus, they're upper bound models, and there are high confidence intervals in these. So I don't think you should think, this model said there might be this many million deaths, so there will be. But again, that judgment is based on my assessment of other experts who have said that, not directly on the models. I don't know how the models work. And I know a little bit. I've read the same things in the newspapers everyone else has. So you have to take them with a grain of salt. But exactly how big a grain of salt and what are the appropriate uses of them? Again, I think that's itself a subject for expertise. And we should be asking that to people who are pandemic preparedness experts, epidemiologists. So this is the kind of question that people should be asking Dr. Fauci on the news conference, Dr. Brinks on the news conferences. And when you ask them that, you sometimes don't always get the answers you expect. So Fauci said at one point, models are always wrong, but we have some real data now we can plug into it. And that seemed to me to be, I don't know whether he's right about that, but it's in line with the kind of things I've heard from other experts.
Well, and in the current situation, because you're dealing with exponentials, they're very sensitive to the parameters that you put into them, and you can be off by orders of magnitude, and so that's one of the challenges, particularly in this case. So.
Yeah, that's what I've, so that's something you can know if you know about if you know about math, without even knowing about disease. But then the added thing is that we have very much uncertainty about the numbers that we're putting into them to begin with. Right. But they could be off in either direction, therefore. But I think the people who do them tune them to be off high rather than off low, because you don't want to, you want to know what the worst case scenario is. So again, what I've been told is that they're good for getting absolute worst case scenarios, but that other than that, they're much better at retrospectively understanding why a disease spread the way that it did than they are at predicting.
Okay. So the last question, I'm going to take this question before we take the break. This is a question from Faith, who says that she received $1,200 from the IRS and wonders what to do with it. I know there are a lot of people who have received these checks from the government, and some of you feel uncomfortable about the fact that this is part of the stimulus package. I have a helpful solution. If you don't want that money, you can use it to fight the battle for improving the culture and improving the political system that we have by donating it to the Ayn Rand Institute. So again, I'll just say, if you're getting value out of this event, we consider this a trade. Our mission is to advance Ayn Rand's ideas in the culture, and you can in effect hire us to do that by becoming an ARI member. as little as $10 a month if you go to aynrand.org/donate. If you want to donate your whatever they're calling it from the IRS, we would be happy to spend that fighting for freedom on your behalf. Were you going to say something, Greg?
Yeah, we could have a new membership level, which is $15,000 a pandemic or $1,500 a pandemic rather than $10 a week. Yeah, I mean, the just on that issue, the money is loot largely from you, some of which is being returned to you. So you shouldn't feel guilty about it. But it is an occasion of a tremendous amount of looting and destruction being done by the government. And one way to fight it is to give your money to people who are, it's yours, but give it to people who are making that case, if that's what you think is true. Okay.
So let's take a break. Again, I just want to mention, I've mentioned this a couple of times, but I'll mention it again if you just joined us for this session. We're doing a raffle. If you sign up on our email list, you can win a copy of one of 10 copies of a book of Ayn Rand Answers. And we have a survey that we're posting. We want to find out who you are and if you're enjoying this. And again, I'll post the link to become a member, an ARI member by donating. So let us draw a line here. We're going to take another break and then we will resume. Let me make sure I get the time right. So 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern time, and we'll do a general Q&A with all of our speakers from today. So we'll see you back in a few minutes.